All right, everyone. We are going to get started. So thank you so much for joining us today. And welcome to the 2023 webinar, GIA's Annual Research on Support for Arts and Culture, Public Funder Edition. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts, and this is our first webinar of 2023. So very exciting that you're joining us for our first webinar of the year. Before we begin our 60-minute webinar, just take a minute to review the Zoom feature so that you have an optimal experience with us today. We'll kick it over to the next slide and show you here. So take a minute to review those. And if you'd like to experience the webinar using closed captioning, you can select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Select show subtitles, and that should take care of your captioning. And I see that a few folks have already started that. So way to go, you found it. That's awesome. If you have any questions for our tech team or have any tech issues throughout the webinar, you can send a direct message to our tech team during the webinar. In the chat, you'll see LGC Tech-Ali. Ali will be the tech support for the webinar. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to Ali and Ali will respond and help you right away. And if you have questions for our presenters during the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We will have a section toward the end of the webinar carved out specifically for Q&A. So as you send your questions in, I'll be facilitating that Q&A, and I'll make sure your questions are ready to go at the end of the webinar when it is time. So available now on the GIA Digital Reader, the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies provides the latest edition of GIA's Annual Funder Snapshot, Public Funding for the Arts 2022. And you can read through this report. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to see how things have changed since last year. There is an explicit focus on public funding, so you'll notice that, and you can take a look at that, keeping that in mind. And today we're going to hear from NASA's very own Ryan Stubbs, Research Director, Mohja Rhoads, Research Manager, and Nakyung Rhee, Research Associate. Excuse me, Senior Director of Research. I misspoke, so excuse that. And they're going to share a summary of the public findings that you'll find in the report. And so without further ado, I want to kick it over to them so that you can hear more. So I'll let you begin, Ryan.
Great, thanks, Sherilyn, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm Ryan Stubbs, Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and I'm joined by my colleagues Mohja Rhoads and Nakyung Rhee, and we're happy to be here today to discuss public funding for the arts in 2022. Our role today is to focus on data trends in public funding for the arts, so we'll provide updates on funding that comes from three primary sources: congressional allocations to the National Endowment for the Arts, state legislative appropriations to the nation's state arts agencies, and funds allocated by local governments to local arts agencies. We'll also discuss some analysis pertaining to the equitable distribution of grant funding for public agencies with a focus on state arts agency data. So before we get into the data and trends, I wanted to provide a brief systems overview about how different levels of government grant makers are interconnected, including the National Endowment for the Arts. So the NEA, state arts agencies, and local arts agencies are all connected with real dollars. And those funds are matched at every level, leveraging greater investments and contributing to a system of support for the arts in the United States. By congressional mandate, the NEA allocates 40% of its annual funding to state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. These funds are distributed in the form of partnership agreements, and partnership agreements support the locally created state arts plans, as well as national and regional services administered by the U.S. regional arts organizations and NASA. Each state arts agency then redistributes federal dollars in accordance with a constituent-driven state plan, thus ensuring that federal funds respond to the current needs of communities and their local economic, educational, civic, and cultural priorities. Some of these dollars are also regranted by local governments and local arts agencies. So regranting helps support public infrastructure for grant making and assures that those closest to the ground are making some of the most important funding decisions. Another important part of this diagram is the leadership role that the NEA plays in building the sector in terms of knowledge and programs. Through federal priorities, this leadership filters through every level of government. For example, the NEA catalyzes cross-sector initiatives and contributes to research to help us understand the benefits and value of arts and cultural production, among many other things. This connectivity of funding and leadership helps different levels of government learn from each other. And that knowledge flows both from federal to local and from local to federal. So it is a valuable exercise each year, and how we do this each year, to look at the combined funding trends from different levels of government, because there are these real connections between funders. And because we're focusing on public funding updates today, and updated foundation data is coming later, I wanted to mention the value of having multiple sectors contributing to supporting the arts and creativity in the United States. So the far largest source of dollars flowing into the ecosystem are from people paying for arts experiences, so what we would call earned income. So there are market forces at play here, and they're important to consider. But the market forces also contribute to some inequities and don't support mission-driven organizations or contribute to some shared goals of inclusion and access. Data indicate that state arts agencies and public funders do a relatively good job of distributing funds broadly to diverse geographies, making the arts more accessible for more people. And we also know that foundations make significant investments and drive impact and change in the sector. So there are multitudes of ways that the arts, culture, and creativity are supported in the United States, with a variety of players that have important roles in contributing to our cultural fabric. And so thanks to GIA for being a place to facilitate discussion and issues facing all types of grant makers in the arts. And with that initial overview, I will hand things over to Nakyung to present the public funding data and trends.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I hope my voice sounds okay right now. Okay, so now I'll be sharing the latest trends in public art investments, focusing on the 3 tiers of public funding for the arts that Ryan just described. So this data is published in the GIA Reader Online, the shared link, and we, NASA, now have more recent updates in the funding data, so we'll share the figure as well. So the first layer of public funding, which is shown on this slide, is the federal appropriations. So this refers to the amount, again, the Congress approved for the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA. So even during the pandemic, congressional funding for the arts has continued to rise, with NEA receiving a record high of $180 million in appropriation for 2022. This amount surpassed the all-time high of $176 million, which was set 30 years ago in 1992. Moving on to the legislative funding for states' art agencies. NASA collects this information with the help of all 56 state and jurisdictional art agencies. The pandemic undoubtedly affected the state economies in 2020 and 2021, but federal pandemic relief and the reopening of state economies have supported a strong rebound in state appropriation for the arts in FY 2022. The total amount reported was more than $830 million, an increase of more than 106% over the previous year, and a new record high in state arts funding. Next, we have funding provided by local governments to local art agencies. Because of the vast number of local art agencies in the US, which is over 4,500 and more, it is nearly impossible to examine all of them. Instead, the American for the Arts has been collecting data from agencies in the 60 largest cities on their total revenue and total local government funding. In 2022, there was a considerable increase in revenue reported, even with a fewer survey participants than usual for the year, nearly half of the number. So the local appropriations in FY22 increased by 23% from the previous year's drop, reaching another record-breaking amount allocated for the local level art funding. So in FY 2022, federal, state, and local art appropriations totaled $1.85 billion, representing a 48% increase over 2021. While this is a significant amount and a record high in art funding, in terms of the total government spending, it is still quite small. The NEA budget accounts for around 0.004% of total government spending, and art appropriations at the state level has been less than 0.05% of overall state spending. This ratio increased somewhat in FY 2022 to 0.07%, but it remains modest. And per capita is one measure of public investment, and the aggregated public art funding per capita surpassed $5 per person for the first time, representing a 48% increase from the previous year. However, when taking inflation into consideration, the total per capita falls lower to $3.32. Okay, then the early federal pandemic support, such as the CARES Act in 2020 and the ARP Act in the following year, provide much needed relief to the art sector, resulting in the increased state and local art agency revenue in FY 2022, as well as FY 2023 this year. So for this fiscal year, 16 states and 2 jurisdictions allocated ARP funding to their arts and culture sector. Our recent state art agency revenue report, which will be released this week very soon, includes a complete list of states that have allocated the supplemental relief funds to the arts in FY23. So I encourage you to take a look at the report if you are interested in more about this. Also, the report includes the outlook for this fiscal year. And I am happy to share with you the snapshot of what we have observed. We've seen a rebound in FY22, right? And this upward trend has continued into FY 2023, thanks to the federal, state, and local relief support for the arts. And combined with the recovery of the economy, this support has boosted public art funding in FY23, setting a new high that surpassed any previous era. So the current data shows a 7% increase in the state art agency appropriation, totaling $891 million, a record all-time high. And it is worth noting that this amount does not fully count some of the one-time supplemental relief funds that some states have received this year. So even without considering such amount or any huge line item, state art agencies have shown a 19% increase in appropriation, reaching another high point in record. So although states anticipate a slower economic growth in the coming year, the majority of state budget conditions remain healthy, according to the NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers. And as the state economy stays strong and the federal relief funding continues to be spent this year or the following year, we are cautiously optimistic that the strength of the art funding from 2022 and this year will continue into the fiscal year 2023 and more. Okay, let's see this chart. At the federal and local level, the remainder of FY23 looks positive as well. The FY23 Omnibus federal funding package includes an increase of $27 million for the National Endowment for the Arts, bringing them up to an all-time budget high of $207 million. Local level budget expectations are also positive, with urban local art agency in the 60 largest cities expecting their funding to exceed $1 billion for the first time ever. So even considering inflations, there's a chance that the FY23 total appropriation for the arts at the federal, state, and local level will reach the all-time high in 2001 funding level for the first time. And this equation, this equates to the total per capita investment of $6.50, which shows on this slide. Okay, so we look forward to share more positive updates in the coming year. And well, thank you for your attention so far. And I will now hand it over to Mohja.
Thank you very much, Nakyung, and good afternoon, everyone. The remainder of this presentation will focus on the second half of our paper on equity and grant making. And currently we are in a zeitgeist, we've been for a little bit, and currently we're in a zeitgeist where grant makers across the US are very interested in learning where opportunities lie in balancing funding, both funding and reach of funding in previously underserved communities. And so historically, we know that grant making has been concentrated in large, urban, and wealthy neighborhoods. And so we can look at equity through these lenses. In these lenses, we can look at organization size and the distribution of grant making from small to large organizations. And we can also examine grant making by urban and rural status to look at how concentrated it is. Grant making is in urban neighborhoods relative to rural neighborhoods, as well as income and poverty status to look at how concentrated grant making is in wealthy neighborhoods. This analysis is at the national scale, at the national level, and the bulk of our analyses here focus on data from SAAs. So our findings are nice findings. They're actually quite good, quite promising findings. We found that the largest organizations receive the bulk of funding. I'll discuss that in a second. Small organizations actually receive the bulk of grants. Rural organizations, once again, this is national, so everything changes when you scale down a little bit. But on the national level, rural organizations are receiving their fair share of funding, and lower income neighborhoods are actually receiving more funding than their wealthier counterparts relative to their population share. So beginning with organization size, which we are basing that on budget size in this analysis and in this slide. And budget size, organization size has been very important for public funders to consider because they are considering the long-standing procedures that in grant making that have advantaged larger organizations and institutions. So this is a hot topic. Overall, for 2020, these data for this portion are from 2020, and they look only at operating support grants, this table right here. Overall, around 8,000 GOS grants were distributed in 2020, and that amounted to $1.5 billion. So before we go into the details, this really does show the success of SAAs in reaching communities across the US. But now drilling in a little bit, the smallest organizations, those are organizations with budgets under 50,000. Receive 46% of GOS grants across the nation, and the median grant is around $3,000. Now, this is very important. This is a very important piece of information for small organizations. That's a relatively small size grant. But GOS grants are very important for small organizations because they generally constitute a much larger portion of their overall budget than large organizations. So grants in the ranges of $3,000 to $5,000 represent often about 10% of a small organization's budget. So these are critical grants. And then when we look at the larger organizations, those organizations with budget sizes over $1 million, they're receiving the lion's share, the bulk of the GOS dollars. But this is a complex situation. It's not necessarily good or bad because large organizations tend to have much larger audiences and they can reach out to much larger groups of people and provide more services. So it's a complex situation, neither good or bad, but these are the statistics on budget size and granting. So moving on to the urban-rural analysis, these are data from 2019, and these are for all grants. So not just operating support grants, but all grants. So these data are also based on census definitions. So that's also important because census definitions don't always translate into the local knowledge. Organizations often have their own understanding of what constitutes rural or urban, but for the meantime, we can only do this type of analysis using at the national level, using census tract data. So according to the census, an urban area is considered as populations of 50,000 or more. So around 14%, according to these census definitions, around 14% of the US population lives in a rural setting. And according to our data, around 13% of grant dollars are going to rural neighborhoods based on census tracts. So there's parity here. So there's parity, almost the same amount of grant dollars are going to the rural population as large as it is. So the next slide is a map of grants going to rural organizations. And as you can see, the concentration is on the east side of the United States, likely because there's more rural communities here than on the other half. I have not looked into those data, but that's what I'm assuming. But this is a nice visual of how grants are dispersed to rural communities. So moving on to income and household income statistics. Another point that I need to make is that these are all these analyses are all done on the underlying demographics. So we don't actually know what audiences are being served, who is actually attending events and receiving services from these grants. We are conducting the analysis on the underlying demographics, so how a census tract looks in terms of demographics. And from a national, as I said before, from a national perspective, this is one of the only ways that we can do it because the census does provide standardized data across the US, so we can contrast and compare. So it's one of the only ways to look at equity in grant making. So in terms of median household income, the picture does look good. The lowest 25% group of census tracts in terms of median household income represent around 21% of the population, and they're receiving 30% of grant dollars. So the numbers do look good there. And I will go a little bit more in depth as to the methodology. We grouped the census tracts into 3 groups. Normally they're done in 4 groups. But people find that a little hard to understand. And so 3 groups is slightly more intuitive. So we grouped the bottom 25% households together, and then the middle 50% households and the top 25% households. So as we move from left to right, that represents an increase in median household income. So for the lowest 25% of census tracts of households, median household incomes, that represents around 68 million of the population. And in terms of grants received, around 345 million. And not all 68 million receive these funds, but it's those within this category that receive these funds. For the highest group, the top 25% population is around 93 million, and total funds received are around 341 million. Population for the middle group is 165 million, total funds received for 484 million. So this represents, for the bottom 25%, the percentage of population is 21%, funds received around 30%. So that means about 9% more funds than the population, if we're looking at a 1-to-1 ratio there. For the middle 50%, they're receiving less than their population, around 9% less than the percentage of their population. And the top is at parity. So the same patterns hold for poverty. Poverty, once again, is defined by the census tracts as households that fall under their income to meet basic needs. So if a census tract has a 20% poverty rate, that means 20% of the households in that census tract are below a poverty rate. So around 22% of the population is at poverty. And these populations are actually receiving 37% of grant dollars. So it does look quite good here. Once again, looking at the methodology, now this time the groups are reversed in terms of order. The highest poverty groups are all the way to the right. That's the top 25%. Middle is still middle, and the lowest poverty groups are the bottom 25%. So as you move from left to right, the census tracts do get poorer. So in terms of poverty, the highest poverty group, around 73 million, this represent this population, and the total funds received was around 432 million. For the lowest 25%, that's 89 million and 189 million total funds received. Middle group, 165 million, total funds received around 549 million. So for the highest poverty group, that represents about a 15% above rate. So they receive 15% more funds than the share of their population. For the highest or the lowest poverty, the group that has the lowest poverty rates, they're receiving 12% less than their share of poverty. And for the middle group, about 3% less. So as I said, the results are kind of nice in terms of access, the distribution of funds to lower income groups, rural groups, and smaller organizations. However, a couple of caveats, I must say a couple of caveats with respects to this analysis. First is scale. As I said, this is a very washed down version of what's happening. Whenever you zoom in, drill down, even just a little bit, the situation changes, and it changes from place to place dramatically. That's why people interested in doing equity analysis really do need to consider scale and try to get as close to the ground as possible. We are using public data sets here, which have their own problems in terms of definitions. And there's always difficulties in conducting equity analysis. Not only is our data really hard to get, really hard to come by, but also resources as well. So even if you have the data, you might not have the resources to conduct such an analysis. And so that needs to be said. And last but not least, data are always disembodied from stories. So quantitative analyses only get you so far. It's always necessary to conduct qualitative analysis and really understand the stories and the voices of people in these communities and their needs. So my last two slides will be slides from looking at the NEA statistics and some local arts agency statistics. The NEA stats reflect very similar to our analysis, and these are for their direct grant programs. And on the left-hand side, we can see that for small metropolitan communities represents around 8.8% of the population and around 72% of NEA-funded projects go to these communities. So there's a match there. For rural communities, representing around 3.6% of the population, and the NEA funded projects are around 11%. And for high poverty neighborhoods, the analysis is very similar to ours, around 22.5% of US households, and the NEA funded projects represent about 35.2%. And last but not least, a little bit of information on the local arts agencies. We don't have the same analyses, grant making analyses for these folks, so can't quite do a similar explanation, but I pulled a little bit of data from their surveys. The Americans for the Arts conducts yearly survey to their local arts agencies, and these are a few statistics from there. So 37% of the surveyed LAAs reported that their primary geographic area is a city or a town, so it's not larger than that. That means that many LAAs are representing smaller geographies. Around 21% of LAAs report that their primary geographic service area represent fewer than 50,000 people. So in terms of census tract, that's rural communities. So 21% of the surveyed LAAs represent rural communities. And in terms of diversities, 50% of LAAs agree somewhat, and 34% of LAAs agree completely that participants in my LAAs programs and the recipients of services will reflect the demographic diversity of our community. So LAAs seem to be on board with trying to represent the diverse nature of their communities. So that is my last slide. And for more information, we have here all the various websites of the different agencies. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a fantastic presentation. You gave so much really great information. And if you haven't already checked the chat, I've dropped in a link to the report that they've been making reference to if you haven't seen it. So you can take a look there. I see that there are already questions in our Q&A queue. So I'll begin with those. And I've also got some other questions that came in kind of before the webinar. So we'll mix all of them together, but we'll start off with our first question. So, and if you have a question that's for a specific presenter, just note that in your question. Otherwise, I'll open it up to the full group. So first question, do you anticipate that the funding levels will go down going forward or after pandemic relief funds end?
Sure, I can respond to that briefly, and then just if Mohja or Nakyung, if you have other things to add, please let me know, or just chime in. So overall, I would say that over the long term, public funding for the arts has mirrored some of the trends that happen in the overall economy and public sector budgets, right? So as recessions happen, public funding trends will often follow that, often lagged a little bit because public sector funds will often continue trends of the economy a few years after. But we do see that correlation between economic conditions and funding, as you would expect. Clearly, what has happened in the past couple of years is, I would say, extenuating circumstances, to say the least, and the large investments that have come into the arts sector for relief funding, I think, has been well allocated and valued by the public and by legislators. And I would hope that those well-valued investments would continue additional investments. However, we know that the economy will change. We know that the funding scenarios will change, and the large investments from the federal government into state and locals, specifically through ARP funds, will eventually dry up. And a lot of it will depend on the long-term budget stability of state and local governments that will allow for investments in public agencies. So that's to say, I have no idea. We'll see what happens. But, those are the trends. Mohja or Nakyung, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to say, well, we hope it can continue into the following fiscal year, and many state arts agency and many supporter of the art and culture sector. This is kind of new goal to keep this level of funding through the following fiscal year or more. So yeah, there's some hope or wish for this kind of upward trends can be continuous.
That's great. Thank you, Nakyung. And yes, there's always hope. We always try to keep the hope alive. Otherwise, why are we here, right? So I'll move on to our next question. Regarding the equity slide, is there a standing trend within the measures shown, or more of a one-time anomaly?
One of those slides was I can't remember, was 2016 to 2019. I think it's the income slides. So I think the income slides have been looking like that for at least the past 5 or 6 years. And Ryan can probably speak to these trends better than I can.
Sure, I can just say a little bit about what we've observed over time. I think what Mohja presented, and also thanks to our colleague Declan Wicks for doing this analysis as well, is a little more sophisticated than what we've in how we've looked at it in the past. In that we're looking at a census tract level of analysis across the country. In some past analyses, we've looked at county level data, and again, as Mohja articulated, like, things definitely change based on the geography that you're looking at, right? And sure, there's different stories happening in different places. But I would say that overall, I think what we've observed generally is that state arts agencies have done a good job in dispersing funds to wide geographies in their states. And so we see that we see these trends. But I think it also kind of brings up a good point in that what we would like to look at is how this data changes over time, right? Because we know that there's been more investments from grant makers of all types in reassessing how equitable funds are distributed and modifying programs and systems to move towards equity. I think these type of data over time will hopefully give us a sense of how some of those efforts are trending, and it will be interesting to see how those trends change or don't change over time, given the investments that lots of folks are making. Yeah,
no, I think that's great. And Mohja, you just toward the end of your presentation, you mentioned that like certain types of data are so difficult to acquire, and like it just kind of looks different depending on how deep you drill down or how broad you stay. So I can appreciate that as well. And just to go a little bit further into that, the idea of collecting the data and just disaggregating the data to get a better understanding of what's going on. If folks wanted to understand a little bit more about kind of what's happening with the data beyond rural versus urban, beyond poverty level. For example, if they wanted to look more about, communities of people who are disabled, or based on race, or based on gender, or like, all of those different kind of data points that folks want to look at in order to target their dollars a little bit more? Would you recommend a particular place that they might go to find that? What might you share with those folks who are on this webinar who would like to know more about that?
Yeah, well, the ultimate data set, the data that you would have is that you would know every single person that engaged in every single activity and everything about them. And
Yes.
those data don't exist. Well,
course.
maybe some credit card companies know that data, but those data don't exist. So as I mentioned in the presentation, the next best thing you have is to look at the underlying demographics of the neighborhood, which in this case is a census tract, because the census tract is around a neighborhood size. So knowing the characteristics of the population that lives in the neighborhood of the organization. And so there are many angles that you could take with census demographics and census information. There's lots of race data, disability data. So you have a wide variety of different demographics that you can look at. We just did 3 just because of time and
Sure.
and also our ability to do the analysis at the time. But you can take it a variety of ways.
Of course. And then we've got someone here who asked similar question: is there an analysis on the distribution of grant dollars by race or ethnic populations? And so I assume you would give the same answer that you just shared. Awesome. Okay. So thank you for that question. I'll move on to our next one from Tatiana. Not sure if it was tracked, but has there been an increase on the percent from budget towards small organizations from a max of 15% as for instance to 25% are not using budget percentage at all?
Sure, I can try to take a stab at that if I understand correctly. So I think part of this is, yeah, just understanding whether or not there have been trends towards how funds are distributed by organization size, right? And I guess I can say that we haven't done much of an analysis there. I would say that just, we've pulled this type of data over time, right? And it's been pretty consistent. So it's not like I have the numbers in front of me and can tell you exactly how it's changed over time, but my observation just in pulling this type of data over the long term is that it's been fairly consistent in terms of like the distribution by organization size. This also differs by funding type and type of funder, right? So here we were just looking at operating support awards coming from state arts agencies, right? And that might look very different for a foundation or for a local arts agency. And it also might look very different from state arts. We know that it looks very different from state arts agency to state arts agency. But again, when we look at the data as a whole, I would say that it's fairly consistent. We haven't seen many changes. But again, I think these are interesting things to observe as people change policies and programs.
Sure. Thanks for that, Ryan. I'm going to kind of blend 2 questions together because I think they go hand in hand. So one person asks, Jennifer is asking, how do we learn how our state arts agency compares to other states? And then kind of like the other side of that question that I'm interpreting as the other side of the question, in terms of drilling down, how do you have state specific data available?
And I can take that one. So yes, so basically, just to give you a sense of like how this type of analysis came about, for NASA, we've been trying to understand and visualize the data that we collect from all state arts agencies to have a better understanding specifically about the distribution of funds and things that we can learn about how equitable our practices are. And so I would say this is kind of a long-term effort in doing that analysis. And we do have individual state analyses for all of this, right? And how we typically present that is directly to state arts agencies and have conversations about the data, because there's lots of nuance here. And this is just one way of looking at one aspect of equity, right? right? And so I think we're very careful in what we can say about the data and how how it affects different states, or what we can say about different states. And so that's why it's not necessarily like, hey, let's look at all state data and compare and contrast, because there are particular narratives that and things to understand about the data. And so I guess what I would say is that, yes, we're happy to share state level data in collaboration with state arts agencies, and that information is available. But also we're just cautious about how we communicate the data, because there's lots of things to consider that go into it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that.
And then I think there
yeah,
was a scale. There was a scale question, and
Sure.
when you have census tracked data and our grant data, we know where we know the addresses of where these organizations lie. So you can actually drill down. You can do an analysis, all the way down to a census tract level. It's just about how you perform that analysis, but the potential is there to go as local as you want, or as regional as you want.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to, Nakyung in the chat. Will dynamic data visualization be shared? Am I reading that correctly? Ryan, maybe you can speak to that. Or Nakyung, you can come off if you want to.
We have like some data visualizations for the state revenue and their kind of operational budgets on our website. So if anyone want to have some general understanding of how the budget size or the revenue each state, in that case, you can check our website. I'll just share the link just in case.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. There's a few questions I have kind of floating around on my computer screen to kind of pull back the curtain here. So thanks for bearing with me there. And that was actually going to be my next question for you, Nakyung. So thank you for speaking to that. So we still have about 10 minutes, so keep the questions coming. So I'm again going to pull two questions together, one that I was considering prior to this, and then one that came in during the presentation. So for all of you, do you feel like you have the proper resources to conduct an equity analysis within your organizations, staff time, ability, data? Do you have examples of that? Someone also in our Q&A asked about models for data collection. We at GIA, we have a model that our Support for Individual Artists Committee did some research and put together that I'll drop in the chat. So we'll have that afterwards, but I want to open it up to you just in terms of you, the presenters as well, just if you could speak to that for folks to understand a little bit better.
Sure, I can take a shot at it, and then please chime in. So as I understand it, the question is about just the resources to do this type of data collection and just how it can be done at different agencies, or maybe just generally how it happens at NASA, right? So one advantage of the state and federal partnership in the arts, one of many advantages, is that the data are reported in a standardized fashion, right? So we have standardized data that gives us information about the location of grants and activities for every state arts agency that's reported as part of the partnership reporting function, right? So there is this structure that allows for us to do this kind of geographic analysis and be pretty confident about with the number of grants that we're looking at, and that being representative of everything that's happening. And so this is one way that we can look at the data. Those sorts of data sets don't exist everywhere, right? And those nationally standard data sets don't exist everywhere. So that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity, right? Because I think part of this conversation is trying to understand what are the questions that you want to be asking and what are the data that you want to be collecting that's going to make a difference and give you some insight about your equity goals, right? So I think that's like the most important question to answer. Unfortunately, like some of that data collection can be complicated or really expensive or really labor intensive, right? So that's just a resource issue that we all grapple with to be able to do more of this type of work, right? But you know, having access to some standardized data sets is good to be able to do this type of analysis. But I would say there's likely the need for a more kind of focused designed research effort if we're looking more into what are the outcomes that we want to see, what is the progress towards equity that we want to see. That might require some more specific questions that we don't have in a standardized way. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but those are just a few thoughts related to some of the challenges.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Ryan. I think that you are answering the question. And just kind of some of our support for individual artists committee members and past members are on this webinar right now, and they were a part of the process that we went through, learning how funders collect data. And we were working in the context of collecting data about individual artists and how they're practicing and kind of who's in the community and what they need and that sort of thing. I'll drop the link here. And although we had this link brings us to a particular lens, there's still a lot of information there that is helpful in learning how to collect data with an equity lens and kind of be more thoughtful about it. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to kind of skip around. I'm going to hop around with all of our questions that are coming in. And so does every state have an arts agency, and do you look at US territories as well? I thought that was a great question.
Yes. Every state has a publicly funded state arts agency that's the recipient of NEA funds for their partnership agreement. You can learn all about state arts agencies on NASA's website, so I encourage you to go there, and that includes every state and every jurisdiction. Right, so the 6 jurisdictions in 50 states.
Amazing, thank you for that. I see a question. Will there be more data coming? I know I'm like not exactly reading it word for word, but I know that's what we're intending here. Before this time next year, do you plan to share anything else out with the GIA community at this stage?
No specific plans. I would say that this is kind of ongoing work, and obviously, next year, if we do this update again, that might be a good thing to explore, like how the data have changed from year to year, because I don't think we've quite presented it in this way before. So, right. Something good to think about.
We also we've done this type of analysis for Ohio already. That's on our website, right, Brian? And so that's a more personalized look at equity and grant making, and we will probably also work with a couple other SAAs as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, both of you. And also I'll note, if you've been coming to our funder snapshots year after year, typically our funder snapshot will include public funding and foundation funding. This one is just public funding, federal, state arts agencies, local arts agencies. The part 2 to this funder snapshot will happen in October. So there will be more data coming, not public funding data, but more data just kind of in terms of like where funding is going and how things have changed since last year. So you can look forward to that. But as Mohja said, there have been some state-specific reports that are underway that are available on the website. And after the presentation, I'll kind of answer some other questions that I'm seeing coming in. After the presentation, there is the email addresses of our presenters. You can reach out to them directly if you have questions. There will be a recording. The slides will be shared. The questions won't be summarized, but there will be a recording, so you'll be able to hear, kind of what went on and recap all of the questions that we had here. Fantastic. So I have a lot of questions here. I'm trying to decide what our last one's going to be before our final thoughts. So, well, kind of, I guess, keeping that thread going in terms of now's public, future is philanthropic and foundation funding. How does public funding interact with or relate to private and philanthropic funding in the arts? That's kind of like a big picture question, but I think we'll get people ready for the future.
Sure, yeah, and yeah, thanks for all the great questions from the audience. We're seeing them here. I think we can try to respond offline, or feel free to send email if there's any follow-ups. Yeah, just to I guess build on some of the comments that I made within the webinar, was that as we look at the totality of the cultural ecosystem, right, that a lot of dollars are coming from earned income activities, but there's clearly the need for support from multiple funder types, right? And so I would say that while public funders do a great job of distributing funds across their geographies and serving the entirety of their jurisdictions, we see foundations making really important, impactful investments that sort of lead some of this change, right? And so I think there are roles, across states, across funder types, across jurisdictions that lend themselves to hopefully funding the arts in a way that works for that local community or that state, right? And so that's one way that they're connected. I would say, you also have partnerships, real partnerships between state arts agencies and private foundations to support the arts in various ways around programmatic initiatives. You have those sort of partnerships at the local level as well. So I guess the point is that while there's different roles and there's different purposes, it feels like all of these roles are necessary to create the fabric that we want.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Ryan. And before we go, for all three of you, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave our attendees with? Any kind of insights that you want to make sure are brought to this conversation before we go?
Thank you for all the work that you do. It's very much appreciated. It's a pleasure to be here. And if I can answer any questions or help anyone, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Thanks, Mohja. Ryan, Nakyung, nothing?
Ditto.
Ditto. Nakyung, is that the same? Oh, yeah.
A second. And well, yeah, it's kind of the first time like we are able to keep talking about record high or new high, things like these positive words. So hope this kind of trend can be continued.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And so finally, we have reached the end. Finally, not in a way that thank God, but finally in a way that we are at the end. Just want to clarify that. I love it here. So thank you all for your contributions today. And the presentation has been recorded. A few folks have asked about that. So yes, it's being recorded. We are sending out a PDF of the slide deck. We're also sharing out a survey because we want to know what you thought, and it is in the chat right now. So please do take it. We really do value your feedback. We want to make sure that we're putting together content that you find very useful. If you have further questions, you can reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, at sherilyn@giarts.org. And finally, thank you so much for joining us on our first webinar of the year. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.